The following program contains mature subject matter and a wide variety of material that may act as a trigger for many people. Discretion is advised.
That's right. This is A Shock in the Dark. This is Season 2, Episode 4, and we're going to jump right back into it. If you haven't been paying attention, or if you haven't been watching the other videos, you need to start with Episode 1 to catch up and know what's going on. This is going to be a big one. This is a big, important episode. You're going to find out what Mr. Entity is, I believe, and hear all about Ed Lorraine Warren and the other people that came to investigate.
This is A Shock in the Dark, Mr. Entity, Episode 4.
I'm in the home of Deborah Moffat, who had a bunch of crazy stuff happen. I didn't realize when I was coming over here that this is the house.
Yes.
Do you have friends, family, whatever, that maybe stop at the front door and don't want to come in?
Anybody but.
Well, I mean, since you have told people about
we have one friend that won't be in the house alone.
Right.
If we're not home, or if we're in another room, he's with us. He's not going to be alone anywhere.
Just to catch people up, there is some sort of entity in the house. It's writing messages on the mirror. You can ask it questions, as Debbie did a bunch of times. And I actually wanted to really ask you about that. Obviously, you communicated with this thing to kind of distract it from being destructive and hurting your mother-in-law. But in those conversations, I mean, there must be some things that you would consider incidental conversation that were fascinating. You were talking about Madame Dewberry, and
yeah.
This thing had been around for at least hundreds of years.
Yeah.
How old did you get the impression this thing was?
No, he would tell me about past lives and he did things. Cardinal Richelieu, he told me about some kind of doctrine. He would tell me all kinds of things. Were they true or not? Like I said, some things I could look up. Yeah, other things I have no way of knowing if they were true.
What else do you remember from those conversations? What other?
A lot of things I won't. It's simple thing, but I won't, because he told me a lot of things from the past or future, and it's best not being repeated.
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
But even stuff from the past?
Yeah, he would tell me some things from the past. It's just some things. I'll tell you one thing that he did write on the mirror. I don't know if you were familiar with a writer named Scott Rogo.
No.
Okay. Scott Rogo was from Los Angeles. And we had called Scott Rogo. And I remember saying to Mr. Entity, well, we contacted Scott Rogo, and he's going to try to help us get rid of you. 2 days later, Mr. Entity wrote on the mirror, Scott Rogo dead. And I said, he's dead? And I thought, uh-oh, Mr. Entity did something. You know, that's the first thing. And then I remember I told Bill, he said, I didn't hear anything about Scott Rogo dying. And that night, on the news came that, then I always said to him, how did he die? He said he was murdered. And he told me he was murdered by two men, had to do with sex. Okay? That night on the news, author Scott Rogo found dead. So I knew about it in the afternoon, or it was the day before, whenever it happened. I knew before it was announced, because he told me about it.
Did you get the impression that Mr. Entity had something to do with it or not?
No, after he explained it to me, I got the impression he just knew it happened.
Gotcha.
I don't know if he did or not. I can't tell you. Did he influence somebody to do something? Could have. But I always got the impression that Mr. Entity wasn't afraid of anybody trying to make him leave. You know what? He wasn't good. He was more powerful than them. This entity, Mr. Entity, was very powerful. He would abort things. He would move, destroy, but he also, like, we had a truck out in front, a white truck. And he picked it up. Now, this was not running. And picked it up and put it in the middle of the street. We wake up the next morning and the truck's in the middle of the street. You know, imagine having enough energy to move a truck.
Yeah, even within the, people who regularly are in the, paranormal fields would say that's an amazing amount of energy.
I mean, how could it do that? See, but it got to the point, this is the truth. Mr. Ernie was with us for 7 years? It got to the point later on, after year of this, it got to the point where it almost became our life. It became, you'd sit there, my mother-in-law would sit, there'd be a knife. Over the first couple years, yeah, it'd be scary. By the 4th year, you'd pull the knife out, put it in the box, keep going. It was like, it became your life. It became your world. Then it became our norm.
Right.
So you learn to adjust. Not that she wasn't still frightened, but it was like, it wasn't that,
It was the normal everyday frightened.
Okay, I gotta check the chair because a demon just, or whatever he is,
Right.
puts a knife in my chair. I gotta check it today.
Were these knives, by the way, were they your knives?
No,
or?
they were not. Some of the pictures are knives. He used to like to take knives and do different positions of knives on the floor. He would put them, I wouldn't, but she would. She'd be standing and she'd look and there'd be a knife right next to her stuck right next to her in the wall.
Your mother-in-law?
Yeah. She'd be washing her face or something in the bathroom. She'd look up and there'd be a knife sticking right in front of her. So, but they weren't our knives. We actually collected a big box of knives that weren't ours.
That's insane.
I know. We finally just threw them away. They were old knives. They were new knives. One time my mother-in-law, we went to Kmart, and her husband and her had a cart in front of us, and my husband and I and the baby were behind. We had some stuff we bought. She gets to the counter, she takes out her stuff, and at the bottom of her basket, there's like 25 steak knives. She didn't put them there. Mr. Entity did.
You, let me ask you one other thing about these conversations, the things that you don't want to talk about. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of tell me what type of things that are the things that you wouldn't talk about?
One of the reasons why I don't like talking about them, because then people, he told me things that are going to happen in the future, okay? Mm-hmm. I don't know if they're going to happen. I don't want people coming to me and saying, oh, Debbie, tell us the future. Right. I don't know the future. Right. I don't know what's going to happen.
But he told you personal things.
Oh, yeah, he told me things, a lot of personal things about people that I wouldn't, he had this thing about when people came to the house, he would give us their whole history. The investigators, right. He would tell us their sex practices. He would even tell us the size of their manhood, which we'd like to do. I mean, crazy. He would tell us, all kinds of things about people. So where he got his information, I don't know. And he spoke all different languages. My mother-in-law was extremely intelligent. She spoke Italian, mm-hmm. She spoke Spanish, English, and she spoke a dialect called Tobresh.
Tobresh, is that?
Tobresh. It's a combination of Albanian and Sicilian.
Gotcha.
Okay? It's an old language. I don't even know if it's spoken anymore. I think it's a dead language. But her family was from Sicily, and they spoke that. My husband knew how to speak it. She knew how to speak it. She didn't know Mr. Entity also knew how to speak it. So she would say, because Mr. Entity, it was like he was always with us. If we had a conversation, he would comment on the mirrors. So she would say, well, I'll fool him. I'll talk to Bill and Tobresh. He will know what I'm saying. He started answering her in Tobresh on the mirror. So proving that... Yeah, you can think you can outsmart me, but you can't.
Obviously, you guys must have gone through, like, writing things down on a piece of paper to each other.
No, I didn't bother.
Because you knew.
Yeah, I knew he was going to be right there. We would go out to a restaurant to dinner. When we got home, on the table would be the name tag of the person who waited on us at the restaurant. So it's like...
I was there at dinner with you.
I just want you to know I was there.
I'll be wherever you are. Yeah. There was even a trip to, I think, Arizona or something you guys went on?
We went to... Oh, that was a trip. We went to Arizona. We were recommended by a shaman that came to the house to see a gentleman called, his name was Ani Ghazi. He was a shaman. First we went to the reservation, and that was strange in itself because it was so isolated. And you go on them, and the first thing you get there, there's just miles and miles of emptiness. So you feel alone to begin with. We finally got to Ani Ghazi's house. He invited us in, and we started explaining to him what happened. He said he could feel the entity was someone near my mother-in-law, someone near her. But he gave her, he said, but I can help you. So he did some kind of ritual, and he made this pill. He made it out of wax and ash and all kinds of, it was grotesque. It was about this big.
About $50?
Yes,
wow.
It was big. My poor mother-in-law, she couldn't even take aspirin. She had a hard time swallowing them. He said to her, if you take this, it'll protect you. Now, she didn't want it. She said, well, can I break it in pieces? Because she was thinking she could break it in little pieces. He said, no, you got to take it whole. So he gave her this, out of this, he had to go get a special cup, and it had this very grayish looking water, and she had to drink it, and she took it. She actually got it down, because she would do anything to get away. She threw it when she got violently ill. That was the night we went back to the hotel, and she got violently ill, and that was the night my father-in-law started howling like a wolf all during the night.
What was that about?
We had connecting rooms. My mother, Bill and the babies were in the one room. Mom and Dad were in this room, and it was connected. Came into Maka. She got violently sick after she took the pill and was throwing up, and she got sick. Finally got her laying down. Dad laid down. He was going to go to sleep. I went back in the other room to be with Bill. All of a sudden, we hear like a wolf howling. I ran in the room. Bill ran in the room. There's my father-in-law sitting up at the end of the bed, howling. I finally jerked. I said, stop. You got to stop. Okay, he stopped. He laid back down, went down. We said, well, he was probably dreaming. We went back in the other room. 5 minutes later, he starts up again. I had to stay in that room the whole night and sit there, and every time he started to do that, I had to wake him up. The whole night he did it, on and off.
That's insane.
Yeah. He was, my father-in-law, when Ed Lorraine Warren came, they did a rite of provocation.
Ed and Lorraine Warren are like probably the most famous paranormal investigators, I would say.
And, you hear a lot of negative stuff about them, some positive, but I have to tell you, Ed Warren especially, he was the nicest man.
It's the couple that the haunting in Connecticut is based on, The Conjuring, a bunch of different movies and stuff.
He was you could sit and talk to this man for hours. He would tell you these stories. He was just a nice man.
So let's talk about the investigators that came to your house to try to get rid of Mr. Entity.
We'll start, like I said, the priest came.
Okay.
Then we had two local people came, two women, because we would go to churches and try to find people to come, and this was a spiritualist church, so they were a member of. Mm-hmm. They came in the door, and for some reason, this is where let me explain upstairs first, before we even go to the investigation, so you understand what was going on.
All right.
It got so bad with upstairs, with him tormenting Ma, that she couldn't live up there anymore. He literally ripped their mattress into pieces. So they moved down. We all lived together in the master bedroom. We had like big beds, the cribs, everything. We all lived together in the master bedroom. The only parts of the house we went to were the master bedroom and these rooms right here. Now I wouldn't go anyplace else. So Mr. Entity actually took over the upstairs. That became his. When he found out that we weren't going upstairs anymore, because if you even went up the steps, as you got higher on the steps, it's like the atmosphere changed. It's like you felt different. So we never even went upstairs. He took over the upstairs for all those years. But he found that we weren't going upstairs to talk to him. He couldn't get his messages across. So we started going into the guest bathroom down here to talk. So that's where most of the conversation was, down here in this bathroom. That's when we started talking there. Like I said, the first one we had was the priest. Then we had these two ladies. They came in, and Mr. Entity usually didn't like to flaunt his things he could do.
Right.
But they came in, and for some reason, it was like he was playing with them. They'd go past the door, he'd slam the door behind them. They came in the kitchen, and he turned on the stove and put the flame up about this high. These two women were holding on to each other. And I said to him, he's just upstairs laughing, because I could almost hear like a presence up there laughing.
Right.
And I said to them, he's just laughing at you ladies. He's not taking you seriously. She said, well, we better go. And the last thing they said to me as they went out the door, the lady said to me, you don't know where we live, so you can't get in touch with us. I said, okay. And they left, and they were petrified when they left. But he didn't usually do that. It was kind of like he was joking with them.
So, I mean, obviously, like different people, he would know what their abilities are and would either tell you about them or play with them or handle them appropriately.
The only people that he never said a word about were the Warrens.
Didn't say a word about them.
There was never written on the mirror anything about the Warrens. Never. Not one thing was written, which was very strange because he would tell us days before somebody was coming all about him. And then when they leave, he'd tell us all about him. He liked to say, no juice, no power.
So if somebody was weak.
Yeah, so like, we had the ladies. Then we had this very sweet young girl who I didn't want to go upstairs and face him. I said, I'd feel better if you didn't. Because she seemed so vulnerable. And, she went up, and she said, no, I know how to clear it out. She went up, and she had a shell, and she had a feather, and she was saging.
Right.
And she went up there by herself, and we heard her scream. She came down holding her arm. She said the shell had been picked up, turned upside down, and put on her hand. And she showed us the burn. So she left. She couldn't do anything.
Right.
She said, I'm so sorry for you. She said, I'll pray for you, and she left. But she was a nice girl. Then we had a man who said, we would try anything.
Right.
Well, and it was very hard. There was no internet. There was no newspapers about this kind of stuff. So what we would do, we would go to psychic fairs. We would go to New Age bookstores. We would go to any place that we could try to find people to help.
Yeah, and anybody you would take in because maybe they'll do the trick.
They sounded like, this is ridiculous. What's more ridiculous than living with something you can't see that can do this?
Right.
So we try anything. We had a magician came, a man came.
A magician.
He came and he brought eggs. He was a Spanish gentleman. And he said, you come upstairs with me. I said, okay. So I go upstairs with him, and he takes the eggs and he puts them in different parts of the room. Next thing I know, the eggs are being thrown at him. So he's covered in egg, he runs out, we never see him again.
What was he supposed to be doing with those eggs?
I have no idea. All I know is a mess, absolute mess. So I had to clean that up. Let's see, then we had two that came, they were really nice people, they were shamans. A Red Wing and, I can't think, was it Fire something. They were very nice. This is when I saw something, Mr. Entity showed himself by using, like, the asbestos upstairs. What's that stuff called, Todd, the pink stuff?
Oh, the insulation.
Insulation?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Okay, so they came, very nice people. They went upstairs, they again said to me, you come with us. I said, okay, I'll come with you. The rest stayed down here. They didn't want anything to do with it. I went upstairs. They too also had feathers and sage, and they said, where does he, because he would always like go into the attic. That was like his spot when he first came here. That's where he came. They even told us, he would tell us things about the attic. So he was in the attic to begin with. So they opened the attic door, and upstairs, the attic door is right in the big room up here. And they would take the sage and they would blow it into the room. They would blow it in, he would blow it out. They would blow it in, he would blow it out. So they said, well, we'll have to go in and confront him. So I stood right on the doorway, the doorway's here, I stood right there, they went in, and the room is the walls and the ceiling is covered in like a pink insulation at that time.
Mm-hmm.
They go in and they said, the Fire Panther said, we're going to make him show himself. So he did something, I don't know, did some kind of thing. He said, you have to show yourself. I stood there and I watched as the installation came off the walls and formed into this gigantic head.
Was it still attached to the wall, or?
It was like hanging from the wall, but it was formed into this big, and it was a huge head. It was like as big as this table.
A three-dimensional head.
But I didn't see the front. I only saw the side view. That's all I saw. And I remember he had real high cheekbones, and a big jutting, real strong jaw. And on the side of his head, instead of an ear, there was a horn. And it started here, and it went round like this, and then it went over the top of his head like this.
Like a ram's horn that went over the top of his head like a waterfall.
Yeah, like this circle, and then up over his head like this. And weird. I stood there, and it could have probably only been seconds. Mm-hmm. But I remember just staring at it, and it wasn't that it was ugly, because it wasn't ugly. It was, I looked at it, and all the feeling I got was a feeling of immense power. The big, strong jaw, the high cheeks, the big, massive horn. So it was like this feeling of power.
Right.
And then it slowly kind of fell apart and fell on the floor. It was absolutely amazing.
What did those guys do?
They came out, and she said to me, this is much stronger than we thought it was. She said, we can't do anything. We can't help you. And this stuff sounds But I tell you, this sounds crazy even now when I talk about it. We had a dog named Jeff. And out of the blue, Jeff came up the steps. And nobody called him. He just came upstairs. And he sat right next to the gentleman. And I was talking to the lady. And I saw he's talking to the dog. And I'm paying attention to her, but I'm also saying, what's the dog doing? And he's doing something with the dog, doing something. And then she goes and talks to him, and they come downstairs. And she said, I'm so sorry because we can't help you. She said, but, she said, the dog allowed us to put the entity into him so you can have a little time to get help. And I said, what? She said, the entities will be enclosed in the dog for as long as he can hold it to try to give you time to get help. And of course, somebody tells you that, you think, okay, I can't even comprehend that.
Right.
But the strange thing is, when they left, nothing happened. Everything stopped. And over the next few weeks, the dog got very, very sick. Very sick. He filled up with fluid. This entity loved water. He would, like when people would come and bring religious symbols or candles, he would throw them in the pool. So he liked water. And the dog filled up with water from the inside and died.
Wow.
And when the dog died, everything started all over again. So you can say, well, that is crazy, thinking they could put it into a dog. But it was gone. And then when the dog died, it was back.
Wow. That's terrible.
I know. We didn't want that to happen. I mean, the dog was such a good dog. But she said, well, it wasn't up to you. Because I said, well, I don't want that. She said, it's not up to you. She said, the dog gave us permission.
The dog volunteered.
Yeah, she said, it was up to him. And he said he'd do it. So that was Jeff. He was a good dog. So then we had the Indians. They were the ones that sent us to Anigazi. Then we had, the Warrens came. When the Warrens came, like I said, they were very nice. She was kind of, she reminded me of an old-time librarian. Kind of straight-laced, not too talkative.
Yeah, I think the paranormal person in the movie Poltergeist was based on her.
Yeah.
Kind of a small lady, and
No, she was tall.
oh, she is.
Oh, yeah, she was a lot taller than I was, and very straight backed. He was kind of rotund, nicest man, so sweet. And they brought a guy with a videotape that taped everything. And I remember they talked. We talked at the table, and then they took us one at each other, one at a time in the dining room and sat us down, and they videotaped everything. Asked us what had happened, and I remember telling them that I wasn't afraid of it, and they kept saying, why aren't you afraid of it? And I would say, I don't know. Either I know it can't hurt me or it won't hurt me.
It had told you it would not hurt you or your children.
I'm not afraid of it. I said, so I can deal with it. I dealt with it on a completely different level than my mother and father, my mother and husband did.
Right.
Because they were frightened.
Right.
And so they saw things different. Instead of, when I saw something, I thought of, wow, this is amazing. They looked at it as something, well, this is scary. So that was a completely different perspective on things. So they questioned everybody, and they said, well, we can't get rid of it, but we will try to find out what it is. He said, we have very few contacts out here in California. This was back in '88, I think it was.
Yeah, they were from the East Coast.
Yeah. He said, but we'll come back tonight, and we'll do the rite of provocation. I said, oh, didn't even know what that was. So that night, I remember my mother-in-law sat in here with the baby. I forgot Brian, and there's so many people that came, you forget the order of things. We had a gentleman staying with us that was a friend of Brian Hurst. Brian Hurst was a gentleman who became a true friend. He was a psychic to the stars. His name is Brian Hurst. A wonderful man. He tried to help us, he couldn't help us, but he found he had a friend that was a psychic investigator. Named, I don't want to put his name down because he's the type, if you say anything, he sues you.
Okay.
So I don't want to put his name down.
Let's just call him what?
You can call him Gary.
Okay.
He's in the book a lot, but I couldn't use his name because...
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Okay, so Gary was staying with us, and Mr. Entity hated Gary. It was so good because when Gary was here, he, instead of picking at Ma all the time, he used a lot of his energy to pick on Gary.
To torture Gary, that's great.
He did to Gary, he would cut his clothes up. One time we were sitting at the table. This was during the day. See, you always think of things when everything happens at night. No, this was 24 hours a day. This just wasn't one day. It was every single day. Gary was sitting right where I'm sitting, and I was sitting there, and Mom and Dad were sitting there, and we were having lunch, I think it was. And all of a sudden we hear clip, 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 and I see Gary doing this.
Touching the back of his head?
And he's going like this, and all of a sudden, and I look at him, and there's a pile of hair on the floor.
He got a haircut.
Mr. Entity was cutting his hair. And Gary jumped up and ran outside. That's the kind of things he did to Gary.
Did you ask Mr. Entity about Gary? Is that how you know that he, well, I guess other than torturing him.
He just hated Gary.
Did Mr. Entity ever talk about him?
Yes. He said Gary's name in a past life was Marcel. And he was I don't know what you call the head of monk at a monastery. I don't know what you call it.
Head monk, let's say.
He explained to me all about past lives and being reincarnated. And Mr. Entity would not call them dimensions. He referred to them as levels.
Levels.
Levels. I would say dimension, he'd say no, they're levels. He would tell me it had all to do with vibration. So he would tell me levels. So Gary was with us at this time. So there's Gary in there sitting next to my husband, and Gary was very knowledgeable about psychic stuff. He was an investigator, he wrote a book, he was very knowledgeable. So we went in there, Ed Lorraine Warren sat over here, my father-in-law and I sat here on this couch, Bill and Gary sat here, and then the guy stood here and he videotaped everything. Ed started doing the rite of provocation, trying to make Mr. Entity show himself, and all of a sudden my father-in-law starts acting a little strange. And I look over and his body is kind of changing. I don't mean, color changing, the way he's holding himself. He kind of drew one arm up to his chest and he kind of hunched over so he looked like he had a hunchback. And he gets up and he walks over to Ed very slowly. Now, Ed had stopped talking when he saw this, so it's quiet. And all of a sudden, Dad gets up, walks over to Ed, looks him right in the face, and I think Ed got a little frightened because he pulled out a little piece of wood and he said, "You can't touch me, this is a relic." He said, "I'm protected." And I remember my father-in-law, now it was my father-in-law's voice, but it had a different quality to it.
Right.
Okay, but it was his voice, but it sounded different.
Like his body had taken on a different...
So, but I remember he dragged, one of his legs, he dragged it when he walked. And he walked like this, and he went right over, they were like this close face to face. And he said to him, "I'll bite your hand off and chew that piece of wood up and spit it in your face." And Ed just looked at him. And they just looked at each other for a minute. Then my father-in-law turned around, went back and sat down on the couch, and went back to himself.
Did he know that he had done that?
He had no idea. He just went right back to normal.
These videotapes must exist somewhere.
Didn't you try to get one, Todd? Didn't you ask him?
Yeah, I tried to get a hold of him. I tried to get a hold of him through Lorraine's nephew. Radio silence. Anything they had, I discovered later, anything that they had, they actually ended up selling off to the same company that's holding the property for The Conjuring. So they've got all the materials. All of the Warren's case files are held by the same entity. It's the ones who oversaw The Conjuring. And all
But the production company or
Yeah, they bought it off.
But I didn't sign a release that they could do these films.
True, and they were not in a public place. They were in your home.
No. So I thought Todd said, "Well, we'll try to get them," but nothing.
Yeah.
I actually ended up going through a bunch of different sources. Went through John Zappas, trying to get a hold of the information from him. Obviously, tried to get a hold of Lorraine Warren, and then the most helpful person was actually Andrea Perrone. I've spoken to her several times. Really wonderful woman from the Conjuring, yeah. And she's the one who gave me a lot of information to kind of follow up on, and just nothing. It's probably sitting in a box somewhere.
Yeah, because they have all the interviews, everything.
That would be very fascinating to see.
Yeah. That's what I wanted, to get a hold of them, just for myself, even just to look at them.
Right.
Yeah. So no, but we couldn't get them.
So Ed and Lorraine, they decided eventually that they could not do anything.
They did. They said they had a friend in Hollywood that had to do with a psychic. What was his name? Jessica, do you remember the guy's name from Hollywood? Oh, I can't remember his name. It's I'll have to remember it. I just can't remember his name.
No worries.
Okay, so he arranged for us to go to a church. It was a high Episcopal church because the Catholic Church didn't want to get involved. So we went to a high Episcopal church because Ed Lorraine Warren said the only thing that will probably help you was an exorcism. So we went to the high church. Actually, Lorraine Warren is my son Jamie's godmother because he was baptized that night and she became his godmother.
Wow.
Yeah, so the man there, he was a big burly priest, and we made arrangements for the next weekend. This was like a Wednesday or Thursday, for that weekend for him to come out and do an exorcism. Well, during this time, my father-in-law got it in his head that we weren't going to have an exorcism. So he told my mother-in-law, you can't have an exorcism. This is an Episcopal priest. You want to get excommunicated from the church? You can't have that in your house. So my mother-in-law, she was the type, anything her husband said was right. She was brought up with the type of Italian that your husband could do no wrong.
Right.
Right, and so that's just the way it was. And she was used to doing anything he said. That was part of the problem right there.
Mm-hmm.
So when the guy actually came all the way from Los Angeles, rang the doorbell, and they wouldn't even let us go to the door and tell him that we didn't want to let him in. He wouldn't let us. He said, no, we're not having an exorcism.
Did your father-in-law have another motive, perhaps?
That's just coming up.
Okay.
See, this is so complicated. That's why I asked Jessica, do I tell him everything? Because it just sounds like too much, but it's like you take all these monster movies and you take a piece from each one, and here it is.
Right.
But that's the way it was. My father, Mr. Entity's down in this bathroom, and I found that if I spoke to Mr. Entity and kept him going with communication, because he loved to talk, that he kind of used his energy. And he didn't have energy to gouge out walls or tear rugs or torment grandma.
Right.
So it was like a fair exchange. I'll talk to you, you leave everybody alone. So I used to talk to him constantly. So one day, but I was the only one that talked to him because everybody else was afraid of him, and Dad made it like he didn't care. One of these days, I'm coming out of the bedroom softly, and I see Dad, nobody uses this bathroom for anything. You don't want to go to the bathroom with an entity in your bathroom.
No, I know I don't.
I wouldn't feel safe. So I see him coming out of the bathroom. So when he goes by, I go in and I look, and he had just washed the mirror. And I couldn't figure out what's going on. Why is he not wanting me to see something? So I asked Mr. Entity what's going on, and Mr. Entity said, Mr. Entity was a squealer, he said, oh, he's coming in and writing and asking me to do things. I said, he's asking you to do things. He said, yeah, he wants me to keep tormenting her.
Wow.
And so the next time I went, he went in, and I saw him go in, and I went in right by Mr. Entity. Wrote on, I have it on one of the pictures, wrote on the mirror, do your own work, you little prick. So Dad actually wanted my mother-in-law dead. See, he would inherit everything. She was kind of, there was money, and she was kind of the one that said, no, you can't have this, no, we can this a little. He didn't like that. He was the type, he always had like a wad of $3,000-$4,000 in his pocket. That's the type of person he was. So he didn't like that she would control him.
It seems like if you did, have that opportunity, there would at least be the tiniest bit of temptation to want to use some of that power. He did. He wanted to use it. Did you ever feel like, oh man, I could actually have something cool if I...
I did, but my first priority was protecting my family.
Mm-hmm.
That was what I wanted to make sure my children, my husband and mom was okay.
Of course.
That's it. But I have to say one thing I did.
Okay.
Because he did tell me. One day I said to him, okay, Mr. Entity, you tell me you know everything. Why don't you give me the numbers for the lottery on tomorrow's night's lottery? I went out, came back in, and he wrote, you give me Lee, and I'll give you the numbers. I said, okay, never mind.
Yeah. Fair exchange. Wow. I have to ask, and just, I promise you this will be the last time. Because I know that he had told you some things about yourself, like when you were going to have a child. Mm-hmm. What did he tell you about that?
He told me, congratulations, you're having twins.
And you had no idea.
I didn't know I was having twins.
And then that happened.
Yes.
as far as things that were happening in the future, if you could just characterize them in some way. You don't have to tell me anything that he said, but just something like, it was about like, the president and like years later, or just anything.
One thing was about a president.
Okay.
One thing was also about earthquakes.
Okay.
As long as I'm in California, we're okay. If you see me leaving,
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. Call me before you leave, please.
Things like that.
Yeah, okay. I get it.
Yeah,
That's great. I just want to know what kinds of things. And then as far as past things go.
Past things, all kinds of things he would tell me. And I would say to him, well, who was I in a past life? And he said, you were Letta. And I said, who was Letta? He said, this is way long when everything started. You were Letta. Letta. And when sometimes he would write, he'd get upset with me. The worst he ever got upset with me, he'd say to me, you get in my way. And then one time he wrote on the mirror, Debbie can control Metta, but she can't control me. I have no idea who Metta is.
Have you ever found out any other information about
Do you
it?
have any idea who Metta was?
Still haven't found anything about that.
Hmm.
But he said, Debbie can control Metta, but she can't stop me.
And of course, you have to have researched the triangle with the squiggly line out of the bottom.
Talk to Todd about that, because he did research for a year on that.
Todd, you want to?
I went through the regular sources first, looking through, kind of starting where I knew from. I started with like the Le Megeton, the Goetia, standard text, and then I started branching out as I kind of learned more about the story. I figured, okay, I'll go through Yoruba, going through the symbols of the Yoruba religious practices, Santeria, and I could never find anything which really concretely pointed toward it. Little bits and pieces here and there. Didn't really make any breakthroughs until I put the whole thing in front of my friend. His name's Nineveh Shadrach. He's a practicing Muslim, and he's heavily into the occult aspects of the Muslim religion. And he said, oh, yeah, of course. It seems so familiar to him. He said, it's a I can't remember the exact, I think he said the Al-Amar tribe of, some of the underworld Ifrit. I said, oh, I know almost nothing about this. So he put me on the path of learning more about the jinn. And that's something that I know it's kind of been a little bit in the zeitgeist recently. I know Rosemary Ellen Galley did some work on it. So I started with her work, ran dry very quickly, and then I started just going through actually the books that my friend had written. And I started finding, oh yeah, look at this. There's so many similarities between the phenomena that he had written about extensively and the things that had happened here. And I went, oh. I had poked around at the whole concept. Okay, I went through the standard things where maybe it was a ghost. Maybe Mr. Entity was a ghost. Then I thought, okay, not really powerful enough to, a ghost wouldn't really have the kind of juice to get done the kind of phenomena that was described here. Maybe I thought, okay, demon. And then I went through, okay, all the different types of demonic entities, Judeo-Christian, the Goetia, all those type of things, and ran dry very quickly on it. I went to a lot of experts on that and just nothing. And not until I went looking at the jinn did things start falling into place. And that's where the symbol kind of fell in. And I said, oh yeah, look at this. So yeah, that was the final thing. And that really would have cemented things that call me Prince really would have fallen in. Yeah, it seems as though Mr. Entity, if anything that I can kind of pinpoint, I'd say probably jinn.
Wow. That's a lot of research, man. That's good.
That was actually a couple years of research, just kind of rabbit holing after rabbit holing. And every time I kind of came up with an answer for something, 2 more questions would pop up, and it's like, okay, well, now I've got to kind of figure out which line of research to go along. And I ended up writing as I went along kind of the preliminary research here and there and different phases of it. But in the end, that's where I've come to at this point, is where I could say, without having been there at the time, I can't answer anything with any kind of certainty, but it really heavily points, if I had to say it, I'd say it heavily points in the direction of being
Investigator Todd Hendrickson calls it as he sees it, and at least at the time of the recording, saying he thought it was a Jen. Interesting. That's going to go ahead and wrap up this episode of A Shock in the Dark, Season 2, Mr. Entity. On the next episode, we will completely wrap this up and find out what happened in the end to Mr. Entity. Where is he now? Until then, good night, whoever you are.